welcome to everyone. It's fantastic. Look, more than 1,000 people in the room. How cool is that? So what I'm going to try and do in just my opening remarks before Cass and Liz will introduce him is just kind of set a bit of a scene about where we're at, really. So, you know, it's still a pretty young activity. And if you remember in some areas, you know, in medicine, the classic well-quoted stat is a 17-year adoption of an effective practice. Well, it's not even 10 years since in 2010, in number 10, we set up the Behavioural Insights Team. Of course, Cass was ahead of us in the White House already, so he's got a decade. But still, that's not very long. And the question is, what have we achieved? Where have we got to? So I thought just in these remarks, we're trying to turn some numbers and work out, you know, what are the big wins, maybe make some comments about calibrating what's the right level of sort of success rate we should expect for our work collectively. And then also, of course, you know, a few cool things that kind of tease us really for the next 2 days. So kind of thinking about impact, if we have this sort of graphic, I can move around, can't I? You know, the number of people reached by a given intervention, a nudge of some kind, and then what's the scale of the impact? And where are we at? So, you know, there's kind of basic insights, some really cool ideas, often stolen from North American universities. Particularly when we've got the whole question of, well, even if it works once, will it work again? John List at previous BX has talked about this. And then, you know, policy changes. Does it go into a mainstream policy change to be done at scale? So let's have a look and let's think about, you know, what's happened over that nearly a decade. So if we go back to sort of 2009 and we say, really, what was on the landscape at that period? Well, we had in many ways, probably the biggest single thing which actually was in place was the sort of Opower style, you know, how much energy is my neighbors using, right? That had been in place, borrowing on Bob Cialdini's work, you know, sort of 2% type impacts, but quite large numbers of people already being reached. Because the famous default things, save more tomorrow and so on, actually for the most part was still a kind of insight. It was a good idea. I think New Zealand actually were a very early mover, but it was mainly in that territory. Similarly, tax, when we were starting doing that, again, partly inspired by Bob Cialdini's work, it turned out there was a little piece of the Treasury had sort of done an intervention, but it wasn't a trial. So it's really worth remembering how little there was in that landscape, actually. It was just a few sparky ideas. So let's kind of start to roll forward and say, well, how have we done? And we're using a kind of, this idea, if you like, we often talk about unicorns in business, you know, $1 billion you know, business as a unicorn. What are our behavioral insight unicorns? Well, by 2012, we can say some of these have now moved, right? So yes, the energy reference things have now become an even bigger thing, probably with tens of millions of people reached. By 2012, we, for example, in the UK, had introduced the switch defaults on pensions. We've now run quite a number of trials in relation to tax and revenue, bringing them in, significant replications and so on. So definitely moving into the cusp of that sort of area of a kind of unicorn, $1 billion impact. But where are we now? Let's have a look. Oh, sorry, other things going on, I should say. Well, our new ideas were coming up around that time. We had, it's a very clear graphic. I should say thanks to Ed, who's done all the work on these slides. That's two people talking to each other. It's a job interview. This is, when we were starting to do the work in job centres, can we get people back to work faster? We had the kind of new ideas. We were starting to do trials in other places, including Australia, looking at consumption patterns and relation to obesity, and lots of other things. Also at that time, we made a kind of, actually it wasn't really done on a trial basis. We made changes to electronic cigarettes, which in our view, and I'll come back to it, was almost immediately e-cigarettes, making them available. It's had quite a big impact. So let's just scroll forward. Well done, Ed. Look at that. PowerPoint in action. And then I think we can pretty clearly say we have at least a half a dozen now billion-dollar kind of interventions. So, but if we have the kind of criteria, have literally 10 million people being reached and a decent sized impact. Well, yes. I mean, across the world now, on tax and revenue, I mean, many countries have now been doing this. The Indonesia trial, for example, alone was more than 10 million just in the trial, right? How extraordinary. So really large numbers. And our HMRC, our revenue service, has been doing many of these kinds of interventions now over a period. We still have the kind of energy reference type uses, and actually I was just talking to someone from the Netherlands. They're running a trial at the moment last night about this. Of course, pensions. Now we have more than 10 million people in the UK who've been saving as a result of a change to the default. Similarly, if we take things like the getting people back to work faster, we now not only have the original replications, the secondary replications. It's been done in Singapore, been done in Australia. Recently, we did this also in Moldova. Yes, if you ask people about what you can do next week instead of last week, they get back to work significantly faster. And when you work out the effect, I mean, the UK, 2.4 million people a year going through that kind of process. E-cigarettes too. I know it's a controversial one, but our view is actually it's a pretty big impact. Our Public Health England now reckon a kind of median midpoint estimate is about 40,000 extra people quit a year in the UK alone as a result of the availability of e-cigarettes and they're being more effective as a route. If we quantify those health effects using a sort of drug equivalents, that is easily past $1 billion a year. So we definitely have a whole clutch of these things. We're in a very different world than we were even 5 years ago. And of course, there's lots of other new ideas bubbling up. I hope, fantastic having Bob Schiller here to talk about a whole range of things, in our view, very exciting areas around using economic interventions to get the economy working better and so on, using nudges. Lots of issues around well, actually, Grant was talking about some of them in terms of energy and environment. Things like the AMR, trying to deal with antimicrobial resistance, absolutely massive issue for the world. We don't only have the original trial we did prompting GPs to, prescribe less antibiotics, but we have replication in Australia, for example, with 3 times the effect by going to specific GPs, etc. Getting kids to do better in school. Not someone having a drink, that's supposed to be someone having a pill for tuberculosis, which you think, more than 1 million people in the year die from TB, basically because they don't persist with taking the drugs, right? Incredibly important. Fake news, we'll hear more about that at the event today, and loads of others. I guess my main point, actually, is just to give that sense of we do have these really quite well documented now, very large effect interventions. One thing I just want to get across is we're all very excited about, and we talk about that, and I also serve ministers as national advisor on what works, is what's the right ratio of things that succeed, So we'll talk about the great wins, and you'll hear lots and lots of those, but in general, even here, you'll hear less people presenting on, these are a load of things that did not work, right? But that must be part of what we're doing here, right? So we'll try lots of ideas, huge numbers. We'll test some of them once we judge that, and then only a small number of them will actually really work and be able to be scalable. What's the right sort of number? So just to borrow from colleagues in the our What Works Centre for Education, the Educational Endowment Foundation, Kevin is speaking, actually, fantastic institution. What have they had to do? They've gone through more than 11,000 papers, basically everything they can get their hands on in relation to educational research. They've filtered that down now and done nearly 200 large-scale, actually randomized controls in British schools involving more than 1 million kids. And how many of those, with a lot of judgment and prototyping in it, actually then turn out to give you a significant, strong effect and are scalable? About 1 in 4, maybe even less than 1 in 4. Why do I think this is important is because alongside the energy of what we're doing, we also have to bring our policymakers, ministers like Grant and others, to realize actually that's what normal will look like, right? We're going to try out lots of things and they aren't going to work. And we have to sort of socialize and have people in their minds. That's going to be usual. And we have to sometimes celebrate that people will have heroic failures. It was a really good idea. Hey, look, we've had plenty of them. We tried something out and then it didn't actually work. And to get the world used to, and indeed our publics, in our countries, used to the idea that that's normal, that's how it will be. So unicorns of tomorrow, well, goodness, there's so many fantastic events and sessions. The big dilemma, I'm sure, for many people will be which one to go to. But just pick out a few examples, ones we think are pretty interesting, I think interesting, from different places in the world. So this is an intervention from the US. Liz Linus and the US team have done around burnout. So in many public sector areas, there's big issues with, particularly a high-stress thing like you're taking 911 calls. It's a very difficult job. You get high levels of burnout. So we see public sector areas where you can get, 40% dropout within 2 years, quite a number of areas. Is there anything we can do about that? Well, let's have a look. This intervention essentially is a series of sort of motivational and prompts where where people on a kind of over a 6-week period are given, prompts to think about their work and the impact that it has, hear stories from other 911 callers and so on, reflect on it. It's quite light touch. And the key question is, would it actually reduce the number of people who literally quit the job? And the answer is, yeah, it does. It does. It's quite an elegant, a beautiful effect, actually. And, give a sense, from quite a light touch intervention, more than a 20% reduction in burnout. I think it's really interesting. It's a very, very cool result. It's a one-off, again. Can we replicate it? Will it work elsewhere? Very powerful. You can hear about that, by the way, and other kinds of things on the work-based, how to build a better organization, one of the sessions today. And Liz Linus actually is also around. Another really difficult issue, and I think that's one of the challenges for us, is to move into really quite difficult topics. This is from work in Australia around sexual harassment, which sadly is an issue in many countries. And can you design an intervention? In this particular case, we were really trying to target upstanding. Why don't people intervene when they see something which is unacceptable behavior, right? And can we prompt them? So this relatively light touch intervention, a lot of it E-based, and particularly using something around social norms, the number of people who say they would intervene, right, to make people more confident in interventions. Does it work? Let's have a look. This is the numbers of people not only reporting having seen an incident, but that they actually did something about it. There's a control, and then this is, I've chosen one arm of it, the intervention. So, 30% increase. It's pretty neat, actually. This particular outcome working, I think, both for men and women. Actually interesting, and it's slightly troubling. Some aspects of the intervention seem to work rather better with women who become more active. And what can we do with men to make them, give them an extra kick? The last one I thought I'd just mention is kind of interesting glimpse, possible unicorn. Sorry, one of the sessions, of course you can hear about that later today, is we've been really interested in, can we get behavioral economics to do more around economics and the functioning of the labor market? So this is an intervention which, again, I think no one in the room, unless you're involved in it, will have seen it. We think is very, very neat, which is, can you make the labor market function better? And this is one example of it as part of a series. So the idea here is particularly around, can you get more employers to advertise jobs to be done flexibly? So it turns out most jobs can be done flexibly, but that they're rarely advertised in that way. So we actually have what we call a double nudge, if I partly also choose it. A lot of our interventions are of that form. So we first of all have to move firm behavior, but what we're ultimately trying to do is then in turn impact, in this case, the workers more directly. So can we do that? And we're using an intermediate platform to do this. So people doing their job search, can we first of all persuade firms to advertise the jobs as being flexible, as I said? So like this, it'll be on the kind of menu. Oh yeah, flexible options are available, right? Can we do that? And then what will be the consequences if we do that? So let's have a look. It's good size N, you can see, more than 200,000, by the way. So we get a lot of firms actually involved in this. And can we get, this is the percentage who are advertising the roles, these roles, sorry, as flexible. And then with the intervention, yeah, we get a very substantial uplift. So this is more than 100,000, I think, extra jobs who are advertised in this way. So that's a pretty stomping increase. Of course, the thing you really want to know is, well, what does it actually do for applicants? So let's have a look at that. This is the number of applicants for the jobs, right? When there's no flexible working, but we've managed to prompt people in RCT, remember? Then that's how many they get as applicants when they do advertise them as flexible. So it's a really beautiful kind of double nudge, we think very consequential, but also an illustrator of a class of interventions which is a step into the functioning of the labour market and the economy more generally. And again, having Bob Schiller talk about that, talk about economics today, I think would be a great challenging session. Okay, so you can hear more about that later today. So finally, before we get going and we hear from Cass, not only do we have these big wins now, I think we need to calibrate, as I said, some things, what's the right success level, but pushing into more and more areas. And I won't go through them all, but there's just lots back on energy. Fantastic work from Australia. We've been involved recently around actually using defaults. And Grant was talking about it. It's all very well having your Tesla, but if it's running on coal because of how the grid is operating and how you charge it really matters. So to get people to move on to essentially defaults where if you've got an excess in the grid, you stop your charging, it's really consequential. So very interesting areas around that. You'll hear about that. Yeah, we've been doing work for a little while as to whether we can shift people to eat more carbon-friendly diets. You'll hear about that. Fake news, goodness, good, fantastic sessions and some nice treats in store around that. Again, really active work, quite profound really about what we can do in relation to fake news, either on the kind of supply side, but also people's capacity to spot, interpret, be less affected by it. In relation to social media, not least its impact on mental health, incredibly important area. Sludge. We all heard about Nudge. For those who haven't heard about Sludge, Sludge, of course, is the dark shadow, in some ways, of it. Subscription traps and so on. Incredibly interesting, active area. What can we do around that? Can we do other kind of positive interventions? So in relation to FinTech, we've been doing fantastic work with the Money Advice and Pension Service, and also with players like Monzo as to whether we can give people more tools to manage their own financials better. Incredibly interesting. Around AI and machine learning, of course, very active area. Sendil Mullin-Nathan was over a month or so ago and pointing out how extraordinary is it, actually, if I think about my kids, right? Literally the world's best minds working on which movie they should watch in the evening using AI and experimentation. If you say, which course should they do at university? You know, what are you talking about? What they got? Maybe talk to a lecturer. How crazy is that? On productivity, yeah, again, mainstream economic issues, long tail, conflict across the world, cohesion, incredible sessions we'll have the next 2 days on that. Obesity and public health issues haven't gone away. And then finally, in relation to applying behavioural insights back on policymakers themselves with things like, we've obviously published this year, policymakers themselves are human beings subject to overconfidence and so on. We should understand that. What can we do about it? Build institutions accordingly. So, goodness, it's fantastic to have everyone here. I do think, certainly for me, the big dilemma has been, wow, there's so many amazing sessions, so many friends to catch up with. It's going to be quite difficult to decide what to do. But I think I just wanted to at least get us going with some sense of where we're really at. In less than a decade as a community, I think we've made enormous progress in terms of the breadth of what we're all doing. We now have some really big wins where we can say, instead of what we were 10 years ago, we think it's a good idea, there really are these sort of policy unicorn, billion dollar plus impacts that are out there. And our great challenge then really is, regardless of what happens on Brexit or other bits of the world, these big challenges remain, right? Climate change, social cohesion, conflict, and so on. And can we use the best of behavioral and social science in order to come up with solutions to that? I guess we're in this room today because we think that's true, it's possible, and, well, have a fantastic BX. Now, I need to introduce Elizabeth, my colleague, who's a fantastic behavioral scientist in her own right, leads a lot of our work on economy, including stuff on Sludge and consumer behavior and labor market and lots of other things. And you're going to come and also introduce Cass. Anyway, main thing is welcome. Have a fantastic BX.
Thanks.